In 2008, EA Redwood Shores took a gamble on a new IP and created what many consider to be one of the greatest survival horror games ever made. Dead Space shares a lot in common with other games in the genre, most notably Resident Evil 4, but it was also unlike anything else at the time. Despite horror in space being a staple of the film industry, games hadn't extensively explored this setting. The backdrop of space wasn't the only drawcard. It introduced new gameplay ideas, and it was impressive on a technical level too. It would go on to win a number of awards, including a BAFTA for Best Use of Audio and the DICE Award for Action Game of the Year. It was an important milestone in gaming, and it's still referenced today for its innovation. Being well received by both critics and players alike, it was unsurprisingly a commercial success, spawning 2 direct sequels, a couple of spin-offs, and a crap ton of related media, including a comic and 2 animated films. Ironically, it would also be something of a swan song, as game studios ditched survival horror in the coming years in favour of more action-centric titles. I first picked up a copy in 2019, and I'll be honest, my expectations were pretty low. Having never played it, I was skeptical that it could live up to the hype. After all, this came out pretty early in the 360's lifespan, and horror games have come a long way since. So I was positive that without a handy pair of nostalgia glasses, there was no way this could be as good or as scary as what everybody says. Apparently I was quite wrong. In 1996, Capcom released the original Resident Evil, and with it coined the phrase survival horror. Resident Evil wasn't the first survival horror, but it was arguably the most influential, helping pave the way for a number of franchises in the 90s. By 2008 though, survival horror was on the way out. Games like Silent Hill, Parasite Eve, and Alone in the Dark had all been successful, but most had failed to reinvent themselves with the same level of success that Resident Evil had with RE4. Back then, Jim Sterling wrote an article about the decline of survival horror and how Dead Space and RE4 were obvious examples of this. I can't say that I totally agree with old Jim on this. While it is true that franchises like Resident Evil would progressively mutate into action games, and that RE4 was clearly the beginning of this shift, I think that Dead Space is actually more of a traditional survival horror than the game that inspired it. While Dead Space does take a lot of cues from RE4, it arguably adheres more closely to the design philosophy of the original. Tough enemies? Check. Manual save points? Check. Lack of resources? Check. Confusing level design? Check. Jump scares? Oh, you better believe that's a check. And of course, slow and clunky movement. Okay, so compared to the tank controls of the 90s, it may as well be Shinobi 3, but Isaac isn't exactly a master of track and field. You could make an argument around how certain elements aren't survival horror in the purest sense, such as being able to move while shooting, or the heavy emphasis on combat. But rather than straying from the formula, I think these are good examples of how Dead Space innovated in a way that doesn't detract from what makes survival horror tense. So before I go on any further, I'd just like to frame everything with the context that I played it on hard. I think playing it on easy or normal dilutes a lot of the tension simply because of the abundance of resources. Playing it on hard is an entirely different beast and offers a much more authentic survival horror experience, and I suspect this is how the developers intended it to be played. Now, it would be easy to label Dead Space as derivative for the number of references, similarities, and direct rips from the games and films it's emulating, but I interpret this as more of a love letter to the genre rather than a lazy knockoff. While there are many elements that feel appropriated, the art direction isn't one of them. Its dark evocative visuals are unique and still very effective, and this is largely due to the excellent use of lighting and some truly epic level design. These range from claustrophobic corridors to vast chambers, and the density within each environment is high. In particular, I love all the little details that provide a glimpse at what life was like before everybody turned into angry meat demons. Do you remember that scene from Aliens where the Marines are searching Hadley's Hope for the first time? There's this one shot where you see a half-eaten donut and what looks like a cup of coffee, as if the person it belonged to had been there just moments before. It's a small and seemingly insignificant detail, but it tells a story of the people that used to inhabit that space, and when juxtaposed against the cold, harsh reality of what we're currently seeing, it creates this incredibly eerie atmosphere. There's a ton of this environmental storytelling throughout the Ishimura, and it makes the necromorphs all the more creepy. You can tell that not only did the devs most likely watch Aliens a couple of times, but also that a lot of thought went into creating these environments. The game's sci-fi setting also allowed for some creative environmental puzzles. The zero-gravity sections, for example, require you to use every surface and think about conventional space in 3D. This makes enemy encounters really goddamn stressful too, as it's so much harder to predict where they're coming from. Although each area has its own look and feel, surfaces throughout the game have a similar metallic appearance, which makes it really easy to get turned around in a moment of panic. This seems to be a deliberate choice because the level design is actually quite linear. The 360, which was the lead development platform, doesn't have a lot of memory, so along with creating the illusion of a labyrinth-like layout, it was almost certainly used to circumvent this hardware limitation. This linear approach doesn't mean there isn't backtracking or exploration, but it's not as freeform or as necessary as something like Resident Evil 2. You'll generally be able to collect everything you need from a location on your first visit. This is one of the few things that stands out to me as a bit dated. Rather than being encouraged to explore, you're generally funneled in a specific direction with a single task to complete. One pitfall with creating levels that have a similar appearance is that everything has a similar appearance. There are a couple of areas that stand out, but by and large the parts of the ship you visit all look like a factory or a lab. For a ship with a crew of 1,000, the recreational and living spaces seem few and far between, and the ones you do see are again cold and metallic. I could be wrong, maybe bars, clubs and bedrooms are just not that popular in the future. Regardless, the lack of variety does become obvious the more you play. Overall though, almost every part of the Ishimura is well realised and creepy as hell. The level of detail also extends to the fantastic necromorph design. From the bloated pregnant that can erupt spewing out lots of smaller enemies, to the freaky space babies that can cling to walls. That's right, this game has demonic space babies. Each has their own uniquely disgusting appearance and specific requirements for disabling them. Apparently the character designers looked at car crash photos and dead animals for inspiration. And yeah, it shows. The necromorphs are... yeah, they're fucked up. Isaac's suit is equally intricate, and each time you upgrade it, there are new flourishes to marvel at. Like, there's this tiny little monitor that you can only see when you angle the camera in a specific way. It's just awesome. Probably the most impressive part of Dead Space's design though is the use of lighting. Good lighting is essential for an effective horror, and Dead Space has heaps of it. Like, heaps. From crisp rays piercing through windows and broken blast shields to tiny blinking lights on equipment. It's not just baked in either, dynamic lighting is used frequently to cast dramatic shadows, and it's even used a couple of times for jump scares. The shadows on the 360 do look like they may have been rendered on a Pentium 386, but they're effective nonetheless. Speaking of stuff that looks dated, let's talk about the menus. Pretty much everyone has lauded the fact that there isn't a head-up display, and that all of the necessary information is part of the game world. This technique is called a diegetic interface, and it was and still is very forward-thinking. Many horror games have since used this approach, such as Until Dawn and Metro Last Light. It's great, and it makes the whole thing more immersive, and it's one of the many things that has kept Dead Space feeling so fresh. Unfortunately, this immersion is broken as soon as you have to deal with one of the many interfaces throughout the game. Every time you have to access one of these menus, you're presented with a cluttered and difficult to navigate UI. In a way, this does increase the tension because trying to use them in tricky situations isn't easy, and maybe this was the intent. But to someone who creates UIs for a living, it's a constant reminder of what we used to think was futuristic back in 2008. If you think I'm being overly harsh, just take a look at the Xbox menu from the same time. Vintage. Thankfully, the parts of the game that haven't aged well don't make it any less atmospheric. You might be wondering though, is it still scary? If you haven't played it before, then sure, the first couple of hours are pretty stressful. After a while you do get kind of wise to the game's tricks, and although it does remain tense, that's mainly due to the difficulty of the encounters and the resource scarcity. The main issue is that Dead Space relies heavily on jump scares, and even though a lot of effort has gone into making them different each time, the way you encounter them becomes very predictable. For example, when you enter a new area, you'll normally get a jump scare. You'll then have to take out a few enemies, complete the objective, at which point you'll get another jump scare, and then have to take out a few more enemies. It's not exactly the same every time, and as I said before, the jump scares are rarely repeated, but once you figure out this formula, it stops being so scary. I don't think that it failing to remain scary for the entire 15-hour campaign is really a big deal though. I've played plenty of scary games, and even the scariest can't maintain the same level of intensity from beginning to end. Resident Evil 7, which is one of the scariest games I've played in recent memory, didn't remain scary for the entirety of its campaign. Same as Alien Isolation. Sure, the unpredictability of the alien keeps you on your toes, but after the 50th time it's killed you, it's more annoying than anything else. I think Dead Space is actually at its most terrifying when it's not trying to be. Simply creeping around the many dark hallways on your own is way more nerve-wracking than when you're shown something that's supposed to be scary. One of the key reasons for this is the sound design. As I mentioned at the start, this is an area in which it won a lot of awards, and while it's a bit primitive by today's standards from a technical point of view, it's definitely still effective. Again, I think the sound design is at its best in the quieter moments, when your imagination runs wild and every little distant noise could be something lurking in the darkness. Some of the ambient background audio is super unnerving, like the use of whispering voices that give you the sense that you're losing your mind. The story is another tool that's used as a form of psychological horror, and it does a particularly good job at setting the tone. In addition to the cutscenes, there are loads of audio logs, text logs, and crazy person wall scribblings that flesh out the proceedings. The backstory is well thought out too, with plenty of logical explanations for the things that happen. It's not the most original story, and the twists are kind of predictable. None of the characters are all that likeable either, but even still it's entertaining, and the cutscenes never go on for too long if it doesn't interest you. If it does interest you though, there's a comic and a full-length animated movie that covers the events leading up to the game. I can't comment on the comic because I haven't read it, but the movie is kind of terrible. It also has some massive spoilers despite being marketed as something you should watch before playing the game. It is pretty damn violent though, so there's that I guess. So you know how Doom Eternal's approach to combat has been one of the central talking points? Well, Dead Space is kind of similar. Choosing which enemies to deal with first and what weapons and abilities to use requires strategy. You can even use some necromorphs as weapons, which turns each encounter into a puzzle of sorts. Just like in Doom, clearing an area is often the objective, and enemies drop ammo, health, and other resources. Lots of areas go into lockdown. No, not that kind of lockdown. Demanding that you eliminate the threat before you can move on. Combat revolves around having the right tools for the job. Even then, enemies don't go down easily. Missing your shots has a double negative effect. Not only do you increase the chances of taking damage, but you waste valuable ammo. Dismemberment is usually the name of the game, but weak points differ from enemy to enemy, so it's important to have a variety of weapons on hand. The further you get in the game, the more difficult they become, and the more of them you have to deal with at the same time. This usually demands all of your available skills and a fantastic ballet of inventory management and enemy prioritization. Back in 2008, many people thought that being able to shoot and walk at the same time was sacrilege. I think that once you've played it though, it becomes obvious that it isn't. It just wouldn't be possible to have enemies this fast or combat in 0G with an old school stop and pop control scheme. The fact that it's possible to walk and shoot in the Resident Evil 2 remake speaks volumes for how forward-thinking this approach was. Unlike the Resident Evil games, running away is rarely an option because this usually increases the number of enemies you have to deal with. Loads of enemies are fast too, like really fucking fast, and we've already addressed Isaac's geriatric pace. If you die, it's really a big deal though. You usually get placed back at a convenient checkpoint. There are save points placed pretty liberally throughout each level too. In fact, it would have been nice if they weren't so common and there was no checkpoint system at all. Even if you play on Impossible, which is the game's hardest setting, the save system is way more forgiving than I think it should be. Resources like health and ammunition though are scarce, and you'll need to check every locker and skanky toilet bowl to make sure you haven't missed anything. Even then, it's rare that you're ever in a position to waste ammo. The only time you come close to rolling in plasma rounds is just before you're about to tackle a large room of enemies or a boss. Boss battles are really my only big criticism with the gameplay. There are a couple that are okay, but the big set-piece monsters aren't very creative and kind of boring to fight. Maybe they were more impressive back in 2008, but they ultimately feel a bit out of place with the rest of the game's design philosophy. A key component of any good survival horror is puzzles, and although there are quite a few to solve, none of them are all that complicated. Quite a lot of them are presented as environmental hazards that need to be solved quickly, and this is what makes them difficult. Where other games are like, welcome, you have arrived at the puzzle, Dead Space is more like, here's a bunch of scary shit you need to deal with, and oh yeah, by the way, a puzzle. I really like this approach of working them into the gameplay, as opposed to segmenting the game into separate combat, platforming, and puzzle sections. And this is the incredible thing about Dead Space. Although it might be lacking in puzzles in the traditional sense, holistically the game is constantly demanding that you solve problems. I've already talked about the combat being like a puzzle, but the upgrade system requires an element of problem solving too. Likewise, the in-game economy constantly asks you to make decisions about what to spend your limited funds on. Like, should you blow your wad on a shiny new suit, or is ammo what you need at this moment in time? You can buy additional power nodes too, which can be used to upgrade your gear, or you can use them to access locked goodie rooms. The whole game feels like a chessboard that is constantly asking you to evaluate your current position and prepare for future events, and this to me is what separates a good survival horror game from a great one. I played through on 360, and as you've probably noticed, the game's visuals hold up extremely well. There are a lot of rough edges, quite literally, but that's to be expected from a game of this era, and the aforementioned lighting and level design does an excellent job at hiding it. Just like The Last of Us on PS3, the low fidelity of the Xbox actually works well with the grungy art direction. Unfortunately, Dead Space never got a remastering. The closest you can get is by playing it on the Xbox One through backwards compatibility or on PC, although neither gives you modern comforts like more detailed character models or 4K textures. You can play on a higher frame rate on PC though, so long as you're willing to fight through some optimization issues. On 360 you can expect 30 frames per second and a 720p resolution. This performance seems to be pretty consistent too, with no screen tearing or noticeable dips in the frame rate. It is also available on the PS3, but apparently it suffers from some pretty significant frame rate dips, like even as low as 20 frames per second. According to the dev team, the PS3 was challenging to work with, so I'd say that the 360 is probably still the best way to play it. I can't say that I ran into a single technical issue in the 15 hours it took me to complete. So, a couple of prerequisites for enjoying this game. Most critical is that you like scary games in general, obviously. Secondly, you've seen lots of horror films, and in particular Event Horizon, Aliens, and The Thing. And finally, play it on hard. Yes, the first chapter will sting a bit as you get up to speed, but trust me, if you're after the authentic experience, this is definitely the ticket. Apart from some slightly dated visuals, Dead Space feels like it could have come out this year, and why EA has sat on this property without so much as a HD remastering is anyone's guess. If you have even a passing interest in survival horror, you owe yourself to play it.